This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Campaign managers give direction to parties, steer candidates, and craft messages that will connect with everyday Americans. To put it simply, they make the operation run. They see just how personal and taxing presidential contests are. They're the ones left to make sense of the results and help a party pick up the pieces after a decisive loss. Political strategist and analyst Steve Schmidt was a campaign operative for George W. Bush. He was one of the senior strategists and managers for John McCain's 2008 campaign. And he's a co-founder of the Lincoln Project. In the aftermath of the 2016 American presidential election, he's emerged as one of the bluntest and most incisive voices commenting on U.S. politics and global issues. Steve Schmidt joins us now. He's been the host of The Warning, and he definitely warned us. Steve, what happened?
Well, very significant loss for Joe Biden, primarily, the vice president who was on the ballot, Democrats generally, and really the net that we know so far, really the biggest thing is I think back at the words of Jesse Jackson, his aspiration to put together that rainbow coalition. Trump has put together an American rainbow coalition. It is multi-ethnic, Black, white, Latino, male. He ran on malice. He ran on anger. He ran on grievance. He ran on hate. So at some level, when we look at Dr. King's admonitions about an America where people are judged on the content of character, we never presumed that the construction of a coalition that looked like this would be a coalition of malice, yet it is. And it is a majority in the country. For 9 years of Trump, through this election, was always able to say, there are more of us than there are of them. And that's just not the case in this election, given the choice. And so this should be a moment of profound introspection. I think the dumbest thing that you read in terms of comments or comments that people are making is, I don't want to hear it about Joe Biden, or it's not time to talk about it, or it's the wrong time to talk about it. There's 765 days until the midterm election, which will be a referendum on Donald Trump's first 2 years and the performance of a likely Republican Congress, 1,460 days until the next election. And it appears to me that the excavation process, the reality process, is going to take every second of it, because there's a question. And here it is. And a lot of people aren't going to like it. What is conceivably so repugnant about the Democratic Party that a majority of the country picked Donald Trump, with a lot of people, including those who voted for Barack Obama 2 times, who believe Trump, who they range from disliking to disdaining, is necessary to protect them and their families from the Democrats? How did that happen? How could the Democratic Party have become so detached, so lost, that it has created a fantasy that the United States is like the MSNBC green room? And it's not.
Well, in defense of Kamala Harris, they had some decisions to make after hitting the ground, and make them very quickly. And it seems to me that they decided early on not to follow him down some of the rabbit holes that he was digging during the election. So when he said a crazy thing and the reporters did what reporters do and run with their microphones to say to her or the campaign, he just said this crazy thing, what's your reaction? They didn't take the bait, or they had made a strategic decision not to do it. The assignment seemed to be to talk up the country and talk up the possibilities of the future rather than running him down or spending inordinate amounts of time running him down. And they misjudged, it may be that they just misjudged what people were ready to put up with, which seems to be quite a lot.
Well, listen, I think that in the end, the vice president did the very best that she could do in this. She gave it her utmost. There's a moment that comes on The View where she's asked a question. And the question is, would you do anything differently than Joe Biden over the last 4 years in retrospect? And her answer was not a thing. There are two types of elections. There are change elections, and there are more of the same elections. Just like there's night and there's day. This was a change election. And in that moment, she yoked herself forevermore. And that was the first question. That was the first decision, right? That she was going to run substantially on the Biden record, which requires a rejection of what the voters are trying to say. And I'm just going to say this, if I can, which is that I'm a strong believer that adult life requires the ability to hold in your head, in order to survive it, multiple complex contradictory thoughts at the same time. Here's one of them. Trump is the most prolific liar the country's ever had. Ever. In fact, he's the most prolific liar in the history of the English-speaking peoples who's ever held office. Right? Not even close. He's also the most honest president we've ever had in the eyes of a lot of the country. Because Donald Trump is a lot of things, but he's not a hypocrite. And he tells you exactly who he is and what he believes in. So let me ask two questions, right? Who is telling the truth about the border? Would that have been Joe Biden, or would that have been Donald Trump about its security?
They were both being deceitful about the border. Joe Biden was minimizing what was going on the border, and Donald Trump was maximizing what was going on the border, and they were both not telling the truth.
I don't take a backseat to anybody in the criticism, right, of Donald Trump on this, right? But here's the deal, right? The threshold here is not the guy who's exaggerating. It's the guy who's minimizing, because the guy who's minimizing here is the president, right? And what he's minimizing, right, is an avoidance of reality, which ties into the second one, which is his condition. It was his condition, right? And so who was honest about his condition? Was that Trump or was that Joe Biden?
Similarly, Trump was maximizing Joe Biden's deficits, and Biden was minimizing them. When a former president of the United States tells a crowd he doesn't know where he is, he doesn't know anything, he can hardly talk, and then the guy gets up and talks and does stuff and does what presidents do, who's lying? I don't know. What do you think?
I want to get into this. I think this is such an important point, which is that when Joe Scarborough looks into the camera and he tells his audience, F you, if you disagree, that this isn't the best version of Joe Biden ever. He's sharper, he has more acuity now than he's ever had, right? Gauge that for what it is, appreciate it, and also appreciate that there's a cohort of the population that's seeing the condition with their own eyes, reacted very badly to constantly being yelled at by the Democratic Party or being gaslit by them on TV, saying he's never been better. At any rate, he was not up for a second term. And because of a profound selfishness, which will be his legacy. I called for him to get out 2 years ago, be a one-term president. It all would have been differently. We all make choices. Because of him and Jill Biden and Steve Schmidt and Anita Dunn and Mike Donald, small handful of people who gaslit the country, the Democratic Party found itself in the position where it was in. And then the campaign went out and talked about Brat Summer and Campaign of Joy and all of this stuff. Where was the big animating vision? What big core message did she deliver? What great idea was put forward? What John Kennedy-like call to arms, to action? What revelation of philosophy was there? Vapidity combined with talking points, combined with data to make a hollow case against a vicious man that in the end wasn't believed by the American people, in part because Joe Biden never treated the gravest threat to the Union since the Confederacy like a threat. He treated it like a prop. The prop was always there to raise money, to turn out voters. Donald Trump wasn't prosecuted. When he was, it looked political. A disaster. And so when the American people were told Bidenomics is the best thing there's ever been and Joe Biden is FDR, and over again, the political frame of stories from the White House is the American people have to be grateful for their president, who does that sound like? And so in the end, right, one of the greatest acts of egotism in world history, Joe Biden's, which is antithetical to the humility of the nation's founder, broke his promise, grasped for more, and has done profound and grievous damage to his country. That's reality.
You know, I wondered at points during the last 4 years why no one on the Democratic side of the ledger was able to talk honestly to the country about what was going on. If Donald Trump had won re-election in 2020, there was going to be inflation in 2021 and 2022. The pandemic had bollocksed up the world supply chain. Money had blown out the door. Huge amounts of money had blown out the door. And as the country reopened, it became apparent that all of that money helped stave off a much worse recession. And there was going to be inflation. No one on the Democratic side ever said to the country, look, the inflation was the cost of us not having mass layoffs, not having more empty store shelves, not having things much worse. No one ever talked about inflation as a thing that happens from time to time. I was a young worker during the last big inflation in this country. It sucked. It was terrible. But when a former president turned to me as if he had nothing to do with it and said, this is the worst inflation ever, that was a lie. He knew it was a lie. Nobody ever talked about real life and real economics and what real dollars do in real economies. Nobody on the Democratic side acted as if this is something that had to be talked about, either in an exculpatory way or a real talk kind of way or any kind of way that would help the country understand what we were going through. Instead, it just went on, became the albatross that it did around the necks of Democrats, and they never, ever had a message for the country about why it happened, what's happening now, how it's changing. Nothing. It was astonishing, really.
When Biden took office, he put forward a budget. Larry Summers said to him, don't spend that much money. You're going to enhance the inflationary cycle. And nobody listened. So, here's the advice. When you come in, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat. Trump is obviously going to be dedicated to the extremism that he's committed to, and every word that he said he meant. But someday there will be a normal person back in there, and they should tell someone from their own side no on the first day. Make people unhappy. It's the key to being a good president, right? You have to liberate yourself from your friends. And Joe Biden didn't do that after having won an election by 44,000 votes across 3 states. And then he allowed the singularly gravest threat since the Civil War to fester, to metastasize and gather. And it ultimately returned and it beat him in the most decisive Republican victory since 1984 is what it's going to be when it gets done, even though there won't have been as many votes or percentages like there was in 88 or the landslide. This is a very significant victory. And there's another thing that needs to be said about how did this happen? These left-wing progressive politicians running the district attorney's offices and mayoral offices in the nation's biggest cities have been Donald Trump's best friend. There is no person, right, that has done more for Donald Trump than the DA of Portland, Oregon, than the DA of San Francisco, than the DA of Los Angeles, than the mayor of Los Angeles, the mayor of San Francisco, the mayors of these cities who have allowed them to crumble. Since when did progressivism and liberalism mean the right to shit in the street and to destroy the quality of life, open air drug markets, complete lawlessness? And guess what? Part of the progress of America's civil rights movement is a vibrant, diverse, in opinion and thought, American population of Black Americans, Latino Americans, and Donald Trump put together a coalition that every Republican president has long aspired to, and every Democratic president has long aspired to do. It's multi-ethnic, it's multiracial, bound together by an idea which I think is very toxic, very poisonous, but there's never been an election where the side perceived as the weak side beat the side considered stronger in the history of the United States, and there never will be. So Trump lost the election in 20 because he was portrayed as a fool and as weak. And I'm proud of my role in doing that. That didn't happen this time.
What didn't break through along with that was the portrayal of him as someone who breaks the law. And, I get that the vast majority of Americans do not, as I did, read the indictments from cover to cover in Atlanta, in Washington, in New York. If you read them, if you've been a reporter for a day or a witness or a juror for a day in a courtroom, you know that a prosecutor would never enter a court with those bills of particulars unless they had somebody dead to rights.
Why'd they wait till the last year? Why'd they wait till the last year?
I don't get it, and it will be one of those enduring mysteries.
I get this, right? If you wait till the last year, do you get why so many millions of Americans think it's political, like that he walked into it? I mean, when you look at the Fulton County, Georgia DA and her misconduct, right? You're going after the president of the United States. Better be buttoned up. Were these prosecutions buttoned up?
Well, in the case of Georgia, why didn't Fani Willis just say, okay, you're going to take my legs out from under me? I'm out. The indictment is still the indictment. The investigation is still the investigation. I have already a group of guilty pleas. I got people who are ready to flip. I'm not essential to the process. So I will step aside and another attorney will prosecute this case. If you really believed in the case, that's what you would do, recognizing that there were forces that, because you hired your boyfriend, were trying to take you out of the action. I will never understand why the Georgia case never made it to an open courtroom. I understand completely why the federal cases never made it to a courtroom, because they gamed the system in a way that slowed everything down, threw sand in the gears, did procedural motions and new briefs that kept everything from going.
But Ray, I mean, listen, one of the things that I said at the beginning of that is, when he was indicted, is that people like me, as most vociferous critics, have to be the most ardent voices asserting that, you are innocent until proven guilty, and that you have rights, and that the reality, again, is I watched the insurrection on television. I saw it. It was not a priority until the last week of the campaign, right? The question, right, of the threat became very politicized because the Biden administration treated Donald Trump like a threat very situationally until the last year. The Manhattan prosecution is a mess, was a mess, has always been a mess. The American people, I think, it is fair to say, right? You can just reach the conclusion. And I'm a fatalist like this. Like, I accept this. Like, I did not meet any undecided voters, right, in the last 2 months of the election, but I accept their reality. And it's the same thing with this, right? It's reality. It's just reality. And, the bottom line is, this is a disaster for Democrats for so many different reasons, but all of them bound up in ego. Ego. And that's the answer.
Well, if you're a Jack Smith, and given the assignment that he was given, if you find evidence of criminality, if you put together a sequence of events that can only be described as criminal, what do you do with that information if it's late in the term? Late in the term is a political decision. I've found a pattern of criminality is a legal decision. At that point, what should have happened, in your view, as a citizen?
Let me answer the question by saying I don't think I'm capable in an academic sense of divorcing myself from knowing what the outcome of it all has been, right? So the outcome of it all politically has undermined the rule of law. It has undermined democracy. Look, Donald Trump has won an election. He won. And there's consequences. On the rubble of that politicized Justice Department, and he politicized it, right? If a building is burned by an arsonist, it's still burned, right? On the rubble, Donald Trump will seek to dismantle controls and to turn security agencies into departments of vengeance, abuse police powers of the state, abuse revenue powers of the state, and he's going to do it. He's going to do it successfully. He's going to create a climate of fear. You're going to see a rush to kowtow to Trump, right? A great capitulation coming. And everyone, right, in positions of power, right, who would have objected in 2017, had Trump do the things he's about to do, will now either take the position that the things he are doing, the things they are doing, they are in fact not doing, and it's not happening, right? You'll see some of that, but mostly those people will just be indifferent or in line behind it, because the organizing principle of the administration is very simple. Don't tell the president no.
Well, Steve, what you're describing is Hungary. Switch the labels, call it Acme, call it Country A and Politician A and all that. It's Hungary.
That's what they aspire to, right? That's, J.D. Vance has been explicit about that, about his admiration for what Viktor Orban calls illiberal democracy. When Viktor Orban is cheered at these CPAC rallies, and yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what they admire.
Well, along with the knives out inside the democratic world, interestingly, along with that, there's a new strain of critique. It seems to me to be a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but I'd like to hear what you think of it. Don't worry, don't catastrophize Trump. You've exaggerated his downside possibilities. You've exaggerated his menace. He will be reined in by the institutions that predate him and will still be here after he's gone. What do you think of those people?
I think they are naive, and some of them are cynical and opportunistic. What I would say is that in all of world history, there's not a single person who has ever not delivered on the promise of taking vengeance and retribution if they get power, when they get power. So right now, the MAGA movement is infused. The core is filled with arrogance, ready to remake the world. The zealots, the revolutionaries, the Joker politics of Batman, of let it burn like Steve Bannon. These people are ready to go. And they can't wait to get in there, to offend, to jar, right? There's no pretense of being president of all of Americans. This is about America's dominant id now, suppressing its beta ego, right? Democracy, laugh out loud, right? Trump's a fascist, laugh out loud. Trump could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. Trump can do whatever he wants, is the takeaway from the election, which will in the end, of course, be Trump's undoing again, his unraveling. And we're in this cycle that, for your listeners, and this is always hard to appreciate, in this moment of ecstasy, right, of MAGA, it is also a instant of apogee. Even before you get to the inauguration, they'll be in a reentry trajectory. And what the opposition to this, and I don't mean, right, to the first 100 days, I mean to the totality of everything has to reform. And one of the things the donors, the voters, Chuck Schumer's presided over a disaster. Does anybody think it's a good idea moving forward for Chuck Schumer to be the Senate Majority Leader? Does that help? Does anybody believe, right, that the Democrats didn't go far enough left? Maybe one of the most devastating ads in American history in politics will be the Kamala's for they, them. Donald Trump's for you. I don't think for a second that Kamala Harris believes that transgender prisoners should have surgery. But she said she did, clear as day, in an interview. And so then there's a question. I look and I talk to someone, I talk to a Trump voting family member, and I say he's crazy. And they come back and say, how do you feel about transgender surgeries for prisoners?
I think this point, Steve, that you're making brings up one of the most interesting parts of the campaign, and that is the asymmetry of expectations for credibility. So, this one statement, I am perfectly willing to concede that this was problematic and looked really bad on a commercial. But conversely, it seemed like there was nothing that Trump could say that would cause him similar damage, because the expectation is that nothing he says had to make any sense, had to be verifiable, had to be actionable, had to be true, had to be checkable, while everything she said had to be something that could survive fine-tooth comb scrutiny. And that difference was very difficult for her and a gift, a great gift to him. In the last month of this campaign, he was saying just weird, batty things, but cumulatively, that meant nothing. And that will stick with me from this campaign as one of the most interesting differential burdens that I've ever seen in covering politics for more than 40 years. This idea that one major party candidate could say almost anything that popped into his head, malicious, distorted, crazy, just bizarre. It just didn't matter. While the opponent had to say things that were careful, vetted. It's like learning to dance while staring at your feet. She had to deal with the fact that anything she said could come back to her in the form of challenge.
Well, boy, I really disagree with some parts of this in the sense of, so presidential campaign's like an NFL game, right? You're going to get hit. You're the Democratic nominee for president of the United States, running for the most powerful office in the world, right? And there was a deliberate decision to have her evade questioning in the news media, right? And not do a lot of interviews, which I think early on was the right thing to do because most of the interviews are really stupid. But she ultimately makes a number of media appearances, but they're all cultural, right? Is Stephen Colbert, is he a soldier in America's culture war? Is he identified, right, as being on one side versus the other, right? What about The View, right? How does your average American guy, right, connect to The View, right? And if The View is one poll, right, in a race that had such a big gender gap, did Kamala Harris ever do a reciprocal interview that balances The View in the culture, right, that's male? Where was she in that cultural space, right? Now, what I would have done is give a series of very big speeches that were clear, that were aspirational. If I couldn't get someone to write them, I would have someone have plagiarized big sections of them, right, and change a few words from JFK. But I would have said big things, and I would have taken away, right, that she doesn't stand for anything, and I don't know why she's running, right, for president arguments. But for whatever reason, they allowed themselves to get into a trap that she looked weak and afraid by not answering questions, right? And what she was saying in the campaign is, I am one of you all, right? I am a product of middle-class America. I share your values. And then that ad reveals a position that clear as day, that's segmentable into a TV spot that overwhelmingly the population says, what? Now, I was one of the top strategists for the ACLU on the marriage equality campaigns. I gave a speech for gay marriage 3 years before Barack Obama did. In fact, that was the first time I ever got death threats, when I came out for gay marriage. On the day, right, that gay marriage was passed, if somebody had gone out and said, oh my God, this is doom on society. We're going to be losing presidential elections, right? Because, there's going to be transgender people demanding the presidential candidates take positions on transgender surgeries for prisoners, right? This is where this is going to be. This is how the debate's going to evolve. Everybody would have said that will never happen. That's not true, right? So there's been rapid social change in America at a time of rapid technological change, right? We've had 2 women nominees for president of the Democratic Party in the 21st century. We've had the first Black president. We've seen legalized gay marriage. We see one of the highest percentages of foreign-born population in American history. We see a Latino demographic, right, that is no longer first generation, right? It's second generation Latino voting. It's third generation Latino voting. It's fourth generation Latino voting. And a fourth and third generation Latino as an American is indistinct from an Italian or a Polish or anybody, right, who is part of the fabric of the country beyond the first generation. And so what Donald Trump has done is build this working class coalition. It's white and black and brown. And so when you see the response, right, already, from the exit polls, it'll be weeks before you can tell fully when people are like, oh, half the country are Klansmen. Like, no. That's not what happened here. It's not what happened here.
It's a lot more complicated than that. And Steve Schmidt, I'll be interested in seeing both how this evolves as people take stock of what happened last Tuesday and how you take stock of it all as I watch the warning. Or I guess maybe, does it have to be called something else now?
I think things are going to get worse. I think he's going to abuse his office and power and do some terrible things. I think that this is going to be a real time of testing and struggle. We have a real absence of leadership, a real collapse of trust. And before we get to renewal, which we will get to, we're going to go through some things as a country. But it's very important to look very honestly about what happened. And what happened was, going back to the beginning, most people look at an election, they say the outcome was determined by the last thing that happened. It's always determined by the first thing that happened. The first thing that happened, tragically, was an old man filled with ego, pushed on by his wife and 5 advisors, gripped onto power as opposed to letting it go and letting a process play out. And because they did that, here we are.
Steve Schmidt, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you, with special support from Mark and Maury Jane Perry, and Ann and Greg Avis. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Young is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.